All right, so let's talk about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. I had an absolute blast watching that movie. Honestly, I was really surprised. I mean, I enjoyed the first and second Guardians of the Galaxy, but with the current state of the MCU, with the kind of products that Disney has been putting out in the last few years, honestly, I wasn't expecting something like this to come out of Marvel. Had great action scenes, had humor that was actually funny, it had emotional scenes that were sincere and had actual weight, and they felt like they had been earned. The movie is a little open ended, despite the fact that it's the end to a trilogy, and it's a really great end to a trilogy. Captain America, and I'm talking about Steve Rogers, not Sam Wilson. Captain America is my favorite character in the MCU, and I don't think his trilogy was as good as the Guardians was. They did a much better job of bookending the Guardians trilogy despite the fact that it has such a large ensemble cast. I mean, if you remember from Captain America Civil War, that movie was basically an Avengers movie. It wasn't really focused on the emotional journey of Steve Rogers as much. And there's definitely an argument to be made that Avengers Endgame was the bookend to the stories of both Steve Rogers and Tony Stark. And I would agree with that. Thor had some big parts in Infinity War and Endgame, but he also got a fourth movie, which unfortunately was absolute trash. But I think that the Avengers was kind of the bookend for Tony Stark and Steve Rogers. Guardians 3 was a great bookend to the Guardians trilogy. It's actually better in a way to compared to the Avengers because it's such a core group. The team has stayed pretty much the same since the beginning with a couple additions, but they have such great camaraderie. There's so much genuine emotion and they have all these shared experiences versus the Avengers who are very serious. They don't have the same type of camaraderie that the Guardians have. And I wouldn't even argue that they face bigger threats. I mean, if you look at the Avengers before Infinity War and then the Guardians, I would actually argue the Guardians have faced bigger threats. The Avengers in their first movie faced Loki and the Chitauri, which wasn't that big of a deal when you think about it, compared to Ronan with the Infinity Stone and the Kree army, and he also was backed by Thanos. And then in their secondary movies, you have Ultron, who was going to wipe out the planet Earth, but he wasn't like a galaxy or universe threat. Whereas in Guardians 2, they faced Ego the Living Planet. And remember that Ego had a plan to basically alter the entire universe using his own DNA. And he's a celestial. Those big towering aliens from the Eternals film that could easily swat a planet. Ego the planet was one of those creatures, and the Guardians had to fight him. So I think if you compare the first two movies, the Guardians face bigger threats, and they're about the same level of strength and power and whatnot. If anything, the Avengers are stronger because they have Thor and the Hulk. You know, Drax is pretty strong, but he's not Hulk strength. Star Lord had some minor celestial powers in the second movie, but then he lost them. And then if you look at Avengers 3 and 4, the Guardians have about an equal part in those movies, facing Thanos, facing the Black Order, and the rest of the Chitauri army and whatnot. So I think the Guardians have faced bigger threats overall than the Avengers. I think they have better camaraderie. I think the humor balanced with the action is a lot better, and I think the emotion is a lot better as well. Like I said, the movie is fairly open ended. I guess I should talk about the plot first, huh? The main plot of the story is Rocket has a failsafe device attached to his heart, put there by the guy who turned him from a regular raccoon into a humanoid esque raccoon. And after being injured, the Guardians realize that they can't actually heal Rocket because of this failsafe device, so they track down the High Evolutionary, who is the guy that made Rocket the way he is, and he's also been in a similar way to Ego the Living Planet, he's been going around the universe and altering and creating entire species. Like the Sovereign from Guardians 2, that's actually an entire race created by the High Evolutionary in an attempt to create a perfect race. Which also brings into the story Adam Warlock, who was teased at the end of Guardians 2, and I really wish he would have appeared in Infinity War and Endgame, but he finally made an appearance here. I'll talk more about him in a little bit, but he is also technically a creation of the High Evolutionary, and he's actually the one who injures Rocket at the beginning because the High Evolutionary sees Rocket as his one success in a way. Like he looks at most of his creations as abominations, especially Rocket. You know, Rocket was one of the initial creations, so he isn't nearly as perfect as the current Animen or Animal Men, whatever they called them in the movie. But it's his brain and his ability to invent that the High Evolutionary wants. It's the one thing that makes Rocket stand out from every other experiment that the High Evolutionary has created. And so, while the High Evolutionary is sending out people to capture Rocket, the Guardians are actually going to the High Evolutionary to get the information they need to get rid of the failsafe device so that they can heal Rocket's heart, which they do manage to do after a number of emotional scenes where it seems like Rocket is actually going to die. Honestly, I thought one of the Guardians would have died in this movie. They don't. Everyone that you see at the beginning is still alive. I think the only character that was a member of the Guardians or affiliated with them that isn't still alive from the first movie is Yondu, and he actually makes a cameo as it's like a spiritual appearance when Kraglin has to face off against a bunch of enemies, and he's still struggling to control the little arrow with his mind. He actually sees like a not the it's not really a ghost of Yondu, but he just like appears for a second in his mind. You got the Guardians versus the High Evolutionary, and Adam Warlock is kind of an enemy, but becomes a sort of ally towards the end, though he doesn't get to do a whole lot, which is disappointing. I thought the plot was really good. Like I said, it was very, very emotional, and there are some surprising scenes in the movie, like watching animals get experimented on and almost tortured, despite this being a PG-13 Marvel family film. They also drop their first F-bomb in the MCU as well. This movie was definitely Rocket's story, which I was fine with. The High Evolutionary was kind of a weird choice for the villain. I think they mischaracterized him, but I understand why they made the changes they made, and I understand why they made him the villain, despite the fact that he's actually less of a threat than Ronan was, or Thanos, or Ego the Living Planet. But still, the movie was great. I had fun the entire time. There are a couple complaints I have here and there, mainly about the portrayal about the villains, not too much otherwise. Gamora, keep in mind that this is the alternate reality version of Gamora, not the one that was killed by Thanos in Infinity War. So she has no real connection to the Guardians because of the fact that she doesn't have the memories of the alternate Gamora. So she does not have any memory of her other self being in a relationship with Peter Quill, which is a topic brought up quite a lot in this movie, and at the end they still don't get together, which my wife actually appreciated the fact that they didn't force the characters to get back together for this film. I actually would have preferred that they get back together, if only for the fact that this is probably the last Guardians film we're going to see, at least for a while. I mean, we know for a fact that Zoe Saldana, the actress for Gamora, and Dave Bautista, the actor for Drax, have said that they're not going to come back for these roles. So they could recast them, but because of the open-ended way that the movie ends, it's really up in the air whether or not there's going to be a Guardians film or even more Guardians in the MCU. I mean, there is a little teaser at the end that says the legendary Star-Lord will return. So we know that Peter Quill is probably going to stick around even if they recast the role. As for the rest of the characters, Gamora is one of the Ravagers, like the actual Ravagers, not the Guardians of the Galaxy proper. Nebula is she kind of sets herself up as the mayor, like not literally the mayor, but basically the mayor of the celestial city Nowhere. And Drax becomes more or less the caretaker of a bunch of children that the High Evolutionary had been experimenting on and that they had saved at the end of the movie. Mantis also breaks away from the group because she needs to find herself. Peter Quill ends up going back to Earth to live with his grandfather, who is still alive. And again, from the teaser, it says the legendary Star-Lord will return. So I'm guessing if they have him in a movie, it'll either be in cameo appearances in other movies, or they're going to make a legendary Star-Lord film without the rest of the Guardians. In terms of the other Guardians, Rocket Raccoon is leading the newest version of the Guardians, which includes Groot, Kraglin, Adam Warlock, and Phyla-Vell. I'll talk more about Phyla-Vell in a minute. She is one of the children that escaped from the High Evolutionary. Some of the Easter eggs that I noticed were Nathan Fillion actually makes an appearance as a guard for Argo Corp, which is the company that the High Evolutionary works behind. It's kind of like a it's not exactly a shell company because they actually make stuff, but it's mainly there to fund his experiments. But Nathan Fillion, for those of you who don't know, actually appeared in a Guardians of the Galaxy film prior to this. I think it was Guardians 2, where he appeared on a movie poster for a film about Wonder Man. Now, Wonder Man is actually a Marvel character from Marvel Comics. He was an actor turned superhero after his body was converted into ionic energy or something like that. Yeah, so Nathan Fillion made a cameo, I believe, in Guardians 2 as a character for a movie poster, a character which they've actually casted an actual actor in a role for a Disney Plus series. They're basically race swapping Wonder Man, which is weird. I don't know why they wouldn't just bring Nathan Fillion in to do the role. I actually think he would be perfect for that role. And then another Easter egg would be Phi Lovell, one of the many children that escapes from the High Evolutionary and ends up joining the Guardians. Phi Lovell in Marvel Comics is actually like the simplest way to explain it is she's an alternate universe version of the daughter of Marvel, the original Captain Marvel, the Kree soldier slash Avenger, the guy who was Captain Marvel before Monica Rambeau and before Carol Danvers and whatnot. So she's an alternate version of a character named Genus Vell, who is sort of a son slash clone of Marvel. They definitely threw that origin away for this movie. Again, she was kind of an experiment of the High Evolutionary, and they didn't state whether or not these children were children that he took and experimented on, or whether they were children that he actually created from human cells that he gathered. But she does seem to have some type of cosmic powers, which actually reminded me of Gore's daughter from Thor Love and Thunder. At the end of that movie, Thor adopts Gore's daughter and she has some type of like energy blast cosmic powers. It makes me wonder if they're planning out some far in the future Young Avengers team that'll include these characters, but it'd have to be pretty far because they're little kids at this point. I thought that each character got kind of their own hero moment, so to say, which I really appreciated because, again, this is such a huge cast in a movie. And I feel like in the older films, especially the Avengers, not every character got as big of a moment as, say, Steve Rogers or Tony Stark or Thor. Whereas in the Guardians film, each character kind of gets an equal amount of screen time, an equal amount of badass moments. Speaking of which, there were a lot more scenes where one of the songs from the Guardians soundtrack or the what is it, the iPod or whatever that Peter Quill got from his mom, or from, no, not from his mom, it was from Yondu. Yeah, there's a lot more scenes where a song was attached, and it works, but at the same time, I wonder how those scenes would have played out without the songs. Like, if you watch the show Friends, they obviously use a laugh track for a lot of each episode. If you've ever watched an episode without the laugh track, it seems weird. I'm not in any way saying that the film would have been bad without the songs. I just wonder why James Gunn chose to put so many songs in it. As for the villains, the character Aisha of the Sovereign is like a very brief villain. She gets killed pretty quick. Like I said, it's revealed that the Sovereign were actually a creation of the High Evolutionary, so I guess they weren't as important as they thought they were. Adam Warlock is also a creation of the High Evolutionary, but he's definitely, let's just say, better. I mean, he has actual superpowers versus just being a regular humanoid person with golden skin. I thought they mischaracterized Adam Warlock a little bit. He's definitely meant to be very innocent and naive at first, just like he was in the comics. In the comics, Adam Warlock was created by 3 scientists to be the perfect human being. And so when he was quote unquote born, he looked like a grown man. He has like golden skin, golden hair, and he had like some intrinsic energy based powers. He was incredibly powerful. And that was even before the High Evolutionary gives him the Soul Gem, which is one of the Infinity Gems or the Infinity Stones, like they're called in the MCU. But yeah, in the comics, he starts off very naive, very innocent, but quickly picks up on the differences between good and evil, although he's also incredibly pragmatic at the same time, to where he'll kind of ignore the concept of morality if he thinks he's doing something that's overall good for the universe. Like during the Infinity Gauntlet story, he had no problem manipulating heroes into fighting Thanos because he picked out certain heroes that he thought would have the best chance against Thanos, and he said just the right things to get them into the fight. They kind of characterized his innocence as being somewhat dumb and easily used, which he definitely wasn't in the beginning of his appearances in Marvel. Like I said, he was naive and innocent, but at the same time could point out when people were doing evil. So he wouldn't have allowed someone to use him unless he actually believed in the cause. The cause for him in this movie was that he saw Aisha as his mother, and his mother was having her life threatened by the High Evolutionary because she hadn't captured Rocket in a timely manner. So she was killed. Adam Warlock gets angry, but he actually goes after the Guardians and then later allies with them, except he doesn't really fight the High Evolutionary. He just kind of, there's this one scene that I guess is meant as his redemption where he saves Peter Quill, who, similar to the scene in the first Guardians, had basically been exposed to the cold vacuum of space and he was about to die. Interestingly, I actually thought that they were going to have Gamora go save him like he saved her in the first movie, but that didn't happen. Instead, it was Adam Warlock. So yeah, I think Adam Warlock could have been a little better. I mean, if you ask any comic book reader who knows anything about Adam Warlock, their simple explanation to a non comic book reader would be that Adam Warlock is basically Space Jesus. I think the portrayal was interesting, and I didn't mind the actor Will Poulter as much as I thought I would, but I think they could have characterized him just a little bit better. Power wise, though, I would say he's pretty similar. He had the gem in his forehead, but it can't be the soul gem because the Infinity Stones don't exist anymore in the main Marvel universe. So I guess it's just one of those things where they try to keep him to his original comic book appearance, but didn't have the correct explanation for it. Much like Doctor Strange, in the comics, the Eye of Agamotto is just an ancient mystical object, whereas in the MCU, the Eye of Agamotto is actually the Time Stone. So, getting into the main villain, the High Evolutionary, in a nutshell, he's basically a mad scientist who is obsessed with perfection. We're not told how old he is, how long he's existed. We don't really get anything about his origin story. We don't even know if he's human. In fact, it's kind of implied he isn't human because he mentions how he's visited Earth a few times. So, even though he looks like a human being, he is likely just one of those alien races that looks very humanoid, like the Xandarians, I believe, from the first Guardians movie. Like I mentioned before, I understand why they made the High Evolutionary kind of how he ended up being portrayed for the more emotional impact of his relationship with Rocket. But I also think they dramatically mischaracterized the character, possibly even more so than Gore the God Butcher in Thor 4. Like I said, the High Evolutionary, they portrayed him as basically being this incredibly sociopathic, kind of Dr. Moreau like scientist who is obsessed with perfection. We're not told how many years he's been doing what he's been doing, but he's been creating and altering different species around the universe for, I assume, decades because he created the Sovereign. And when we saw Guardians 2 and the Sovereign were introduced, it made it seem like a lot of other planets knew who they were and they'd been around for a while. So I think we can assume that the High Evolutionary either created them at least decades ago, if not hundreds of years ago, or time works differently in the universe than it does on Earth. You know, much like Sakaar, how Thor and Loki went through that portal and they ended up being there for a certain amount of time, which was different from Earth. So maybe it's something like that, or maybe the High Evolutionary is just centuries old. One of the interesting things is that it seems like what he does because there isn't a god. At least that's what he says. There's one point where kind of everything around him is being destroyed. I think it was like either Rocket or one of his own henchmen was kind of questioning why he does what he does. Someone uses the word God, and he's basically said, I'm doing this because there isn't a god out there. He looks at this as his job to create a perfect universe without violence and greed and aggression because there isn't a god out there to do it. Now, this is an interesting theme to put into the final movie of the Guardians trilogy because it does kind of fit with the current theme of the MCU. The Eternals learned that what they'd known for centuries about the Celestials was wrong, and Gore the God Butcher, went out killing gods because he thought they weren't doing what they're supposed to do. And then Kang the Conqueror is also trying to save the universe or save the multiverse because of the acts of other versions of Kang and because of the incursions and whatnot. So you have multiple characters out there who are either alive now or dead, but at one point had the mission of either taking out gods or trying to replace gods, which is kind of weird because we know literal gods exist. We saw them in Thor 4 and in all the other Thor movies. We know that the Celestials exist, who have been creating life on different planets since the beginning of the universe. And we saw the Eternity statue in Thor 4. Eternity being kind of the embodiment of the universe itself. So we know that gods and godlike figures exist in the MCU, which means that characters like Kang and the High Evolutionary just don't like the way that things are going in the universe. Like the gods are out there, but according to these few villains, the gods just aren't doing what they're supposed to do. In the comic books, the High Evolutionary, a guy named Herbert Wyndham, he was born in the early 1900s in England. He was fascinated by the theories of evolution. And at that time, science wasn't as progressed as it is obviously nowadays. I mean, he was before Einstein's time, but he was obsessed with evolution and he created a machine that would advance the evolution of animals. And so he created these humanoid animal men called the Animen, similarly to how he did it in the movie, except in the movie, he was like experimenting on and torturing animals. Whereas in the comics, he basically put an animal in a machine and it somewhat harmlessly transformed them into a humanoid form. And so he did that for decades. Eventually, he created a being called the Man Beast, which was the first predator that he had transformed into one of the Animen. And because he was a predator, he basically turned on the High Evolutionary. He screwed up a bunch of his experiments, including Counter Earth. Now, Counter Earth in the MCU is pretty much a carbon copy of Earth. And on this planet, the High Evolutionary had placed the quote unquote perfect Animen, meaning animals who took humanoid form and didn't show signs of aggression or greed. Now, we know from the movie that this wasn't actually true because we saw a couple funny scenes where like this octopus man was selling like drugs to these goat children. So he even admits that his world didn't turn out the way he thought it would, so he actually destroys Counter Earth. In the comics, he created Counter Earth to, again, be the perfect world where violence and aggression and greed wouldn't happen, except in the comics, it was actually the Man Beast who screwed up that experiment. It wasn't that humanity naturally turned out the same way again. The comic book version of the High Evolutionary was far more altruistic. He didn't like torture. He didn't like violence. In a way, he's the kind of almost the exact opposite of the character that we get in the film. He really isn't your tried and true villain. The point where he starts to become more of a villain is actually due to madness. And that madness is brought upon by seeing not characters, but beings that are just crazy powerful. So there's a point where I believe where he created either Counter Earth or maybe a different planet. And at this point, he kind of has the powers of a god, which is another issue I have with the movie. Is in the movie, he just controls gravity, which I guess in the MCU is kind of a big deal. But when you compare it to his comic book counterpart, that's pretty lame. Like in the comic books, the High Evolutionary at one point used his advancing evolution machine on himself, taking him to the eventual end stage of what humanity would be, which is like an incorporeal energy form. And eventually he basically got his body back, but he still retained his godlike powers. And so he could create a planet like Counter Earth in a similar way to like the god of Abrahamic religions. Like the Christian God created Earth and the different animals and whatnot in, what was it, like 7 days? Well, the High Evolutionary, once he gained his god powers in the comics, he created Counter Earth, which is an exact copy of Earth, and he did it in a matter of hours. So considering that as his power level, after he had created a planet, he witnessed a giant cosmic hand reach out and pluck the planet from its place in the galaxy and put it into a different galaxy. And looking at this galaxy, you see like other celestial bodies, other planets that are kind of aligned in a way to where they're almost on display. And they actually were. The being that had picked up the planet was a Beyonder. Now, the Beyonders in Marvel Comics, I'm not going to go too deep into that concept, but let's just say that they are like possibly the second most powerful beings in Marvel Comics. So, Odin, for example, would be like a flea compared to a single Beyonder. Galactus, if you know who he is, would easily be killed by a Beyonder. The Celestials, who you saw, if you saw the Eternals, these giant, larger than a planet beings, they could be killed by Beyonders. Thanos with the Infinity Gauntlet, even the comic book version, which is way more powerful than the MCU version, easily wiped out by the Beyonders. These are some of those powerful beings in Marvel Comics, not just the universe, not just the multiverse, they actually exist outside of the multiverse. But the point is that they're extremely powerful, so powerful that this Beyonder that had picked up the High Evolutionary's planet had placed it in another galaxy or, space basically, and treated it like it was a collectible. Like this little spatial area with these other planets and whatnot was almost like a cabinet where you would place your collectibles. That was basically how the Beyonder was treating this planet that the High Evolutionary had created. And so having the power of a god and being able to create his own planet, and then witnessing a giant cosmic hand pluck that planet and place it in what amounts to a cosmic shelf of collectibles, it drove him mad because he finally thought that he had the power to achieve perfection in the sense of creating a harmless world where there's no violence, greed, anger, or anything. And this being realizing that there's being so powerful that this perfect world that he had created is nothing more than like something interesting to look at. And that drove him mad. And so from there, he kind of became a little bit more extreme in his tactics of trying to advance the evolution of different species. But even then, he still abhorred violence, greed, hate. Even when he forced evolution on different beings and characters and whatnot, he always tried to not use violence or torture. He tried to be, he believed in being compassionate, which is the exact opposite of the movie version. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. In the comics, he's like a smarter and more compassionate version of Anthony Fauci or Bill Gates. Two people who are fascinated with altering the human genome or upgrading technology to an invasive level without fully comprehending the consequences that could have on human and animal life. I mean, that's a fairly accurate way, I think, of describing Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates without saying they're outright evil. So picture that, but a much smarter and more compassionate version of that, and you have the comic book version of the High Evolutionary. So extremely different than the MCU version. Again, I understand why they made the changes. They wanted to make a simpler, not so cosmic and big scale emotional story regarding Rocket Raccoon. It's just a shame that they didn't even tell like an origin story for the character. He's just a mad scientist. So, although there was kind of an interesting Easter egg at the end when they revealed his quote unquote true face because his face had been scratched off by Rocket at one point. But they took off his mask basically, and his face looks like how it looked in a more recent appearance of the High Evolutionary in the comics. So that was a little interesting Easter egg. But overall, I think his characterization was the main low point in an otherwise amazing film. It's not even that big of a complaint because the changes they made to the character fit well with the movie. I don't know what else to say. It was a great movie. I wish James Gunn would stick around to do other MCU films because it's obvious that he cared about this franchise. I mean, this is the third Guardians movie. It's the who knows what number MCU film. And at this point, Disney is basically just pumping out content without caring about the quality. Whereas this film felt like an early MCU film where the creative team behind it, not only did they care about the project, but they felt like they had to put as much effort as possible into making a good quality because they didn't know if they'd get another movie afterwards. Which is interesting because, again, this is the end of a trilogy, possibly the end of the Guardians franchise. And yet James Gunn treated it like it's the first movie. Like it has to be really good because you might not get a sequel. I think they could choose to not make any more Guardian stories and it would work fine versus the Avengers. I felt like the way that the Avengers kind of broke up at the end of Avengers Endgame was not built up as well, was not treated as well. Yeah, I'm not going to say this is a turning point for the MCU with all the trash we've gotten in the last few years because this was a James Gunn project. He has a very distinct tone for his films. The Guardians was basically his franchise within the MCU, and with a lot of the actors not coming back, with James Gunn going on to lead the DC universe, I think this was a one-off. I don't think we're going to get another quality MCU film for quite a while. I mean, the next film is Captain Marvel 2, which I'm probably not going to see in theaters. There's really no incentive to go see that movie in theaters. But yeah, I don't want to sound like a pessimist, especially because I really enjoyed this movie. And that's kind of the sad part is it was such an amazing movie, but everything that's come before since Endgame and probably everything that's going to come after is going to go back. So this was like this definitely felt like a phase 3 film in a good way. This film was kind of like a time capsule, like a way for fans to travel back to the good old days of the MCU, phases 1 through 3. And it's one of the reasons that I think the emotion in the film was handled so well, because it's emotional because of Rocket's story. It's emotional because it's the end of the Guardians, but it's also emotional because this feels like the quality of film that they would have put out a decade ago. And we're probably not going back to that level of quality again. But I want to end this video on a good note. So I would definitely say watch this movie. I'm almost tempted to go see it again in theaters because I had an absolute blast. So if you've seen it, tell me what you think in the comment section below. Tell me what you think about the future of the MCU. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell so you never miss out on a new video. Thanks for watching.